You're listening to episode 8 of The Secular Buddhist. Today's episode is part 1 of our interview with our friend Grant Steeves on what it means to be a spiritual atheist, enjoyed at Borders Books in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hi everyone. A little bit of news from the home front. According to Libsyn, we have passed over 1,000 downloads of the Secular Buddhist podcast. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the next episodes we have coming. Those of us who are Buddhists and atheists sometimes have a challenge describing what our practice is like. We default to words sometimes like spiritual, and that may not quite fit the bill. There are those of us who are fine with it. We know it's an uplifting, personal development practice, but if we use the Pali word bhavana, we're just going to get blank stares. If we use the word spiritual, there's some understanding, at least with our more spiritually inclined listeners. But others are not so keen on the word spiritual. So tonight we'll be bringing this question of what does spirituality mean to an atheist to our friend Grant Steeves. Grant is a retired educator who taught debate, communications, language arts, and more for 40 years. At an early age, he started reading books on philosophy and religion that had belonged to his grandfather. That was his introduction to Buddhism. In college, he pursued Asian studies, and that was the time in which Alan Watts was popularizing Zen. After graduate school at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, he became interested in yoga and meditation. Grant completed a doctor in theology with an emphasis on cult religions. In the last 3 years, he's been an active member of Minnesota Atheists. He has interviewed and been interviewed on their cable program and radio program, and has lectured on cults, fundamentalism, and atheism. His most recent project is the concept of worldviews. In today's podcast, we cover topics ranging from spirituality, atheism, conventional reality, chocolate, single malt scotch, and sweet, sweet lovin'. Let's join Grant at Borders Books in St. Paul. So we're going to talk about spirituality and atheism, contradictions, redefinition, or marriage of convenience. Mm-hmm. And where, as you and I have chatted in the past,
yes,
we're atheists. And yet, unlike many of our brethren, we have fairly strong spiritual practice and spiritual side. And that sometimes gives them the shiveries as we try to explain, being spiritual. It's not necessarily a dirty word. It's an enriching thing for us. And we run into issues of definition, things like that. What are your thoughts on that? What have you run into? What are some of the fun stories of trying to explain spirituality to us other atheists?
I think it's almost impossible for some. We were discussing with one of our mutual friends, mm-hmm. and he has no experience to identify with it whatsoever. Mm-hmm. The term has no meaning mm-hmm. for him. And he said, "Do you want me to read about it?" And I said, "No, it's not necessary."
Would you like me to dissect one for you?
And then I've had individuals who react by saying they would quit an organization if they use that word. Mm-hmm. They apparently think they know what the word means, at least,
yeah.
And they're repulsed by it because traditionally they're looking at the word traditionally in the sense that it's spirit, therefore it has to be mm-hmm. Related to a godlike creature, supernatural. Mm-hmm. And I look at it a bit differently, simply because of looking at the traditional definitions of coming out of Scripture, in fact.
Yeah.
The Hebrew term is nephesh, which is breath. And I was listening to, I can't recall the name of the author right now, who did Roots. And in his, this was before the book was written.
Yeah.
And he was talking about this, and he said, in Africa, when they give a child a name, the child, they breathe the name. There's the spirit name. And it's giving them the breath of life. I said, it sounds so much like the book of Genesis in some ways. And this is the nephesh, the Hebrew word, or soul. And it doesn't have to be attached at all to the supernatural, but it's rather attached to breath and breathing, which in the Buddhist tradition
would be
the meditation rather than breathing. Sure. That there's some kinds of threads here that are rather interesting. So I have that.
Alex Haley,
yes. And I have that identification with the spirituality. And then I also have the tradition of the Catholic Church, where you deal with it in a mystical sense, which is another. Now this is really getting into the supernatural.
Yeah.
And you're getting into things which are not verifiable.
Yeah.
And you're proving God's existence in a sense, or spirit existence. And to me, that's the wrong route to take, because I see spirituality as a dimension of, as we said, aesthetics, maybe. And more recently, I've started thinking about it in terms of metaphor. That what we're really dealing with is terms that have no concrete identity, but they are metaphors in a sense where they symbolize things that happen out in the real world, but have no concrete existence. And I used the word love earlier, where you can give all kinds of descriptors, maybe even chemical, that happen in the body, but that doesn't encompass what it is. And to me, the spirituality has that kind of a dimension. You can't package it in a chemical sense.
Yeah, not neatly. No.
Right. And aesthetics, the dimension of aesthetics is also, or the concept of beauty. What is beauty? What is the beautiful? In the old Greek sense, that you can't capitalize it. That it's personal. And when you look at religion, you have that personal dimension.
Yeah.
If you look at theology, they have the scripture, which is concrete, though rather imaginative. You have reason, which is part of it. You have personal experience as part of it. I'm missing the fourth one. But you have these elements that help to design what theology is. But personal experience, revelation, which is personal experience too.
Yeah.
But there's a personal experience to it that cannot be defined. And one of the elements is that when you talk to a person who has been born again, as an example, Christian, they're going to describe it in terms of this being filled with the Spirit. I describe it as being filled with some kind of happiness.
Yes.
And again, it's not an identifiable thing, because it's a feeling, an emotion that a person gets high on. And it is very much what happens with AA when they describe the experience of giving up to a higher power.
Yeah.
To me, all those are elements of spirituality that have nothing to do with God.
Right.
They have to do with a change in the person. And I still come back. I like the word aesthetic as applied to it, because that also is another broad term that you can put a lot of stuff under. But it allows us to take it, separate it a bit from religion.
Right. And that's an interesting point. We were discussing this on one of the online spots on Second Life with folks that I was interviewing for a previous podcast, that we're those of us who are pursuing a less religious Buddhist practice are faced with the challenge of teasing out the religious elements and the cultural elements that may not be our own without damaging what we found of value there in the first place.
Right.
And in an article that another podcaster has written, they shy on the side of, I don't want to do that because we may wreck it. And we're of the mind that, no, I'm thinking that can improve it in the same way that we are, when we're meditating, we're kind of letting go of the 5 hindrances, say. We're getting those out of our system so that what's left is more purified experience, moment by moment. Well, that's a very tangible, real thing. That is something we see in experiments with what parts of the brain light up in experiencing meditators and that sort of thing. And where we find it challenging as secular practitioners, whether we're Christian secular or just atheists, whichever our backgrounds may be or what our pursuits are.
Right.
It's challenging to us when we see someone say, well, I know I was filled with fill in the blank.
Right.
Like, well, yes, that's what conclusion you have drawn or been told, but that's we're describing the same experience. And the only thing we actually know is my experience was one of uplifting, and we use terms that are aesthetic terms. So I also am drawn to that word to describe the experience. But what we attribute it to, we can't say, well, I know it was this. And some people say that with great certainty. And there's a strapping on of, they'll use, for example, the word truth, the capital T, when they mean fervent belief, not truth. And there's a mingling of that with, well, that means it's fact. Like, no. It's still a strident belief, and that's okay. You're welcome to have that. That's fine. But don't try pawning it off as fact. That's where things are going to run into some challenges. Yeah.
And there's another element that runs through our culture, not necessarily in the academic world anymore, but in general culture, and that is the duality of the person. That we still have this separation. Either it's the body and the mind, or the body and spirit, or body and soul. And as long as you carry that kind of thought around with you, the duality, it's very easy then to fall back and say that it's separate.
Right.
Whereas I think what is necessary within naturalism or within atheism or within Theravadism is that you begin to think of it not in terms of the duality. You're talking about sort of pulling the strands out.
Right.
That you separate it from this religious jargon that has attached to it and redefine it.
Yeah.
But the fear of a word has always disturbed me. That, number one, there may be ignorance in it, which I think in the case of spirituality, there's some ignorance that goes with this about the definition, because it doesn't have to be given over to religion. That we use what I call sacred words.
Yeah. Yes.
There are certain words which people do not want you to use because they're very disturbing, swear words, or racist words. And they become sacred in the sense that if you use them, you have violated a law.
There's a social convention of not using it.
Yes. I think I can use this example because I hear the word shit now in public, even on television. But in class, I always gave the example of when the Brits were invaded by the French, the Norman invasion. Up until then, Anglo-Saxon is shit. But the Normans brought the word manure, which is a very nice French word. And you could see class distinction, because if I used manure, obviously I was upper class, and if I used the word shit, obviously I'm lower class. It is, as I would say to my students, it's still the same old shit. You just put a different term on it.
Right.
You define the word in the same way, but now you have different terms. But sometimes I think we react to terms rather than what the definition is.
Right.
We make a judgment about a person. And if I can't get a term that is a good substitute, and that's what we've encountered with the word spirituality. You have difficulty finding a word to substitute.
Yeah.
In English, at least. And probably in all language. But why do you need to? And why is it necessary for people to look at a word and react only to the word rather than the content of the word? In other words, how I'm using it. And adjust their thinking.
The perception around that context.
It shouldn't be that painful.
Shouldn't be, but we run into that with one of the first talks I ever gave was about words and right speech in a Buddhist context.
Yes.
And we run into as we look at older texts or scriptures or what have you, that of course there's translation because it's in a different language.
Right.
But even within our own current framework of language, how we use things has significant impact differences, like that word truth. What is what we mean by that, and this comes up a lot in the debate you and I had on the intelligent design and whether it is science or not, and how we define theory in a scientific sense is this is the pinnacle. This is backed by facts and hypotheses and evidence and all that building up to theory, whereas a creation standpoint will be to say, oh, it's only a theory, and use it in a more conventional sense to dismiss it, to denigrate it, and that's not an actual application. So words are always they're as tricky as the minds that use them.
and the failure to this is a debating point that I have with an ongoing debate with one of my former students. He said, I suppose you're going to tell me it's context again. And I said, you're right.
Now you're getting it.
Now you're getting it. That if you look at the context in which I'm using theory, it's not the way you are using theory.
Right.
Look at the context. And he said, well, you should use it in the way that people are used to hearing it. And I said, what's wrong with educating people?
Yeah, and what people?
Well, educating them in terms of the context.
Yeah.
Why do they have to assume immediately their definition is right when the dictionary clearly allows both definitions to exist?
Right. And multiple definitions. There was an interaction I had, and I was on vacation in Rocky Mountain National Park. And I was at one of their higher altitude visitor centers having a coffee. And at the table next to me was this elderly couple who had been passing out pamphlets. And they were having a conversation with their barista, this server, who was, as it turned out, a world religion studies. That was his area that he was studying in college. And I, of course, couldn't contain myself and joined in on the conversation, as I wanted to do, because there was a soapbox handy and I had to stand on it. And the fellow who was the older gentleman who was having the conversation said he was using an example to try to prove his point that things are exactly as it's written in the Bible, which was word for word true and factual. He said, well, the word gnat, G-N-A-T, it's always been that word, never changed. It always means exactly the same thing. And I said, really? You're kidding, right? If you heard of a fellow named Shakespeare, or perhaps Chaucer, you understand how language evolves and changes meaning over time? And he just would not, under any circumstances, acknowledge that there can be different meanings to words. We don't have to be stuck with, in the case of what we're speaking about today, spirituality doesn't have to mean Casper the Friendly Ghost. It can mean a something else. So
Mm-hmm.
part of what, and those of us who have a spiritual practice who are nonetheless very non-religious, I'm openly declared atheist. How do we define that? What can we come up with as a definition that we use, at the very least amongst ourselves? We know what we mean without having a formal definition, but what would we suggest as a definition for spirituality within our community?
I've thought about it in terms of an aesthetic definition and a science definition. Because you could do it scientifically in maybe.
I think
In
we'll
the
miss
sense
the boat.
that we know that meditation brings about chemical changes in the body. There certainly is more information about it in terms of neuroscience, neurology, and the effects in that sense. So you might be able to define it in perhaps a more acceptable materialist-based definition. Patricia Churchland might be able to come up with a good definition for this. And then you look at it as an aesthetic definition. And maybe that has to do more with what happens to the person.
Yeah, the
There's a personal
experiential side of
experience.
it. Yeah, exactly.
That the aesthetic part of it is you gain a sense of calmness in your life through meditation. And so calmness is one of the characteristics I would put down there, and that's, to me, is an aesthetic thing. I think there's also, and I'm making this up as I go along, I haven't made this a precise definition in my brain, but I think calmness is one. I think the other dimension is that in aesthetics is that you feel a part of all nature.
A connectivity.
Yes, a connection with everything. And I don't expect every person who's an atheist to have had this experience. I recall one winter, I'm walking to my doctor's office.
Yeah.
And I call it downy flakes. When you have large, fluffy snowflakes falling. And for some reason, well, I know what the reason is. The overcast, the sun is coming through, and so everything is sort of yellowish, which is bizarre.
Yes, it's an odd cast.
This is yellow snow in a different sense. So it's a different cast. But I'm walking along, and it is over by the university, but it is very quiet, which is also strange.
Right.
You don't hear cars. There are no voices, people, nothing. It's just this stillness within this existence. And suddenly I feel so connected to everything that's around me. Did I think that it was magic? Did I think that God was filling me with something? No. I just felt and it was purely emotional feeling of connectedness to what was around me. And I did have a great sense of calm in reaching that point. I think those are experiences which come under the heading of spirituality, and what some people want to achieve in as an experience. Even for people who are religious, they do not always have that experience.
Yeah.
You talk about this, and they don't identify with that either. So calm. We're coming down to the 2 C's here, or 3 C's. Connectedness, I see, is important. And I think there's also a sense of awe that's attached to it.
Yes, an uplifting.
A positive, kind of an uplifting of the spirit, as they say, and you feel better.
I would agree. Where I'll go into kind of my Buddhist-y take on that. One of the things I'm going to quote one of the people we've been having a discussion on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. about a quote I'd put out there on the evolution of Buddhism, and that has itself evolved into a discussion a bit on enlightenment and what we mean by that. And one of the posters on here, Will Davidson, had said that that I would advocate for a definition of enlightenment that encompasses optimal psychological functioning. It's a very scientific way of looking at it, and I find that very laudable. And that acknowledges that the majority of optimal psychological functioning is the quality of our relationships with others. The other parts being the quality of our intrapsychic relationships and the quality of our relationship with our environment. And so I made the comment that I agreed here that any enlightenment without any actual interactive value seems kind of useless. But Will's statement here is putting the experience of enlightenment into a context of action, of interactivity, that your spiritual practice leading to an experience, which then in turn, as a circular reference in a positive way, re-supports that spiritual practice, because you've now had a fundamental change in how you interact. And that uplifting part, so we're describing a couple of different things that the experience that you describe, which many of us have, where we're in a still place. Mentally, maybe physically, we're in a still place. In a Buddhist-y sense, I'm very intentionally using the word Buddhist-y, I'll describe that at another point, is one where the distractions that we have in our mind have dropped away, and we're more directly experiencing that moment. This is silent, present moment awareness, as I refer to it in meditation, and that is in itself a deeper connectivity with what's going on. And I think that's part of where that spiritual that we're talking about, that there is a calmness, there is a connectivity, and there is, because of that, and the typically wonderful moment that we're in, that in itself is very uplifting. And just a minor segue why I use the term Buddhist-y with a lowercase b is I don't want to have my use of Buddhist with a capital B associated with a particular tradition, a particular dogmatic view. It's Buddhist-y. It's we're taking a chunk of it, but not all of it. So I very intentionally use that word with some frequency by design. So it is very much an aesthetic and a personal experience that we can nonetheless put into practice, as Will was saying in his definition of enlightenment.
Well, and this might tie into the benefits that occur from it when they did the study of prayer. I think it was one of the places was Mayo Clinic, I believe, in which they found that praying for other people doesn't work.
Yeah, nothing feels like prayer, as Dan Barker says frequently.
The only prayer side that works is for the person who's praying or meditating.
Yeah.
There's clearly a benefit there, but it's not. I can't help other people through my meditation or through my prayer, but I can help myself in some respect. Okay, so I see it in that sense as helpful. Another thought that came up while you were talking about this is in visualizing. And I often had students in communication to do visualizing.
Yeah.
That you visualize yourself doing the performance before you do the performance. Because then it calms you. It gives you a sense of being there.
Right.
But I said there's another thing about visualizing which is important. So when you meet someone, you evaluate that person within the very first few seconds. It has nothing to do with who the person is. You don't know anything about their ethos.
Yeah.
You just know, based on the physical, what you see.
Yeah.
Now, if I see you and I don't like you, I'm reacting only to the physical. But I'm also reacting to your expressions. That's the physical, your expressions. So I said, you walk into a classroom as a teacher, and you don't like a student. You look at that student in the same way every day, sort of like the sour grape.
Yeah.
And so you give off this visage that you don't like the person. And they can tell it. They may not be able to describe it.
Yeah.
They may not be able to go to someone and say, that teacher doesn't like me because I can tell by this, and this.
It may not be as clear as John Houseman in Paper Chase saying,
right.
It's hot, this is a shroud, I'm putting you in it.
Dead. Yes. No. So one of my colleagues was saying they were having difficulty with a particular student. I said, well, do you like this person? They said, no, I absolutely despise them. And I said, they know. I said, what I want you to do is this, as an experiment. I said, it works for me. I'm not saying it's going to work for you.
Yeah.
But I said, when I don't like a person, I visualize them. And I visualize them only in positive ways.
Yeah.
I change my frame of reference about them.
Yeah.
So that when I come in contact with them, I'm seeing the positive and not the negative. I'm programming myself to think differently about that person.
Yeah.
I said, will it change your relationship with us? I don't know. But I said, it seems to work for me, even if it's placebo.
Yeah. And what you just described is in Buddhist circles known as metta, loving kindness practice, where you, and it's a very popular form of meditation, in that you, in the different kinds of meditations, there's meditation on breath and mindfulness meditation. Metta meditation is where you start with yourself, which is sometimes the hardest thing to do.
Yes.
And have a sense of compassion and loving kindness and joy in their successes and then equanimity towards them, and then you take it to your immediate family and ones that you would positive relationships to the easy folks first, and then acquaintances that you're from friends to acquaintances, and you work all the way through to people you have more antagonistic relationship with, and work very hard on transforming that. And from personal experience, knowing that you're only harming yourself by being stressed about what Ajahn Songa quoted as other people's shenanigans.
Right.
I put that on the page, and I'll quote that again, that it only helps yourself to make that transformative. And so having gone that route and had a personal sense and knee-jerk response towards an individual in my life, and having to transform that, and such that with very challenging work and concentrated intentional effort, you really can change that around, so that you do remove the reflexive part of it and replace it with a more positive outlook and a more positive response that only helps you.
And as we're talking here, I'm thinking back. I know that some of the visualization ideas came out of my reading of Buddhism, and the idea of compassion in particular.
Yeah.
And I once in a lecture at graduation, I connected the idea of agape within Christian faith, because it's considered Christian love.
Yeah.
And I said, I compare that to compassion. I think that's a better word than the word love, because we throw that other word.
There are other implications. There's other baggage with that word.
Compassion hasn't the baggage.
Right.
That to me is a dimension of spirituality, that you become a more compassionate person, and you begin to look at other people more compassionately. One of the things that came out of my reading in atheism and naturalism is that as you proceed down the road to understanding there isn't a duality, that there isn't free will, but it's a determinism, you start to take on a more compassionate nature toward people.
Yeah.
You realize that a lot of what they are is not a matter of choice. A lot of the people that are in prison in Stillwater, it was not really a choice. And they said, well, they chose to rob a bank or kill someone. At an immediate sense, that's possible. But I'm thinking about all the things that feed into
circumstances that fed that. What's the big picture here?
What's the big picture?
Yeah.
And this is where both atheist and religious people encounter a problem. For the religious person, it's not so much a problem to say believe in free choice and free will, and they'll say people have a choice in all kinds of things. With the atheists, they do it, and they do it without understanding that they're violating their own principles. Because if they're an atheist, they have to be a determinist.
It has to be utterly deterministic, yes.
And if that's the case, then to look at someone who's doing some idiocy and say, well, that's their choice. Is it really?
Yeah, and that's where we run into, I think we get jacked up on where we're looking at things at a very detailed level. The table here is a table, look at it at the subatomic level, not so much. It's a bunch of energy that's constantly rising and falling. But conventionally, it's stable. And to deny that is just ridiculous. So to say at the one point are things, as we look at really closely deterministic, well, yeah, there's some merit in that, some truth to that. Do you have a choice conventionally? Well, yeah. Conventionally, you got a choice. It's how much of one and where are we drawing our line is choice.
My example usually is in terms of we are required, we're by nature to have fluids, but we have a choice.
Yeah,
I can drink coffee, tea, milk,
Scotch
juice,
Scotch
whatever.
is good. Lefroy
Or Scotch.
Awesome choice. I will be linking to Lefroy, by the way, on the webpage just for folks listening, because really it's one of the best scotches around.
So we have choices in that sense. So that it is the illusion of freedom of choice.
Right.
But fundamentally, in a broader sense, no. And and I think carrying around those definitions and attachments to traditional religion, traditional definitions, that's where we have problems. And that when we free ourselves of those, and we start to think about this in terms of how our person reacts, we can identify certain elements of compassion or calmness,
right,
and start to think about that. I think I do identify with that. So if I had inductively asked my friend, our mutual friend, about calmness, he's very much into photography, and asked him about the aesthetics, the art, how he feels when he's looking at a thing of beauty,
right,
and then attached the word, it might have struck him.
Yeah.
But I didn't do it that way. I hit him on the forehead with the word right away, and then lost my possible understanding of it.
Yes, and it's I've often struggled to explain this concept too with more of our hardline friends who are very, very deterministic and excruciatingly so. That I will use because I know there are things that they dearly love and are very passionate about, whether it's their dog or their kids or something, and they will, and I would agree with them, correctly explain this as well. Yes, and this is an evolved thing, and yep, I'm right there with you. That's very true. But what you got to understand is that whereas you and I will describe that in very scientific terms, the experience of it, what's actually happening with us, is the same as the person who's describing it as spiritually uplifting. And so I will say, if you have haven't had chocolate. You've never had chocolate. And someone describes a mint truffle to you. Milk chocolate, because really dark chocolate's just kind of nasty. I know. You're giving me this expression. It must be a dark chocolate.
I love chocolate.
Okay. But when you give a living truffle to someone who has not had one before and suddenly, this is what chocolate is.
Right.
Well, that's an experiential thing, and we can describe it till we're blue in the face, but we'll never capture that wonder that is the Lindt truffle.
Well, or you can look at this in terms of how stages of development in appreciation of things. I took Godiva chocolate to my one sister.
Yeah.
And she's telling me how wonderful this is compared to a Hershey bar. And
I don't think I can eat a Hershey bar anymore. I really don't think I can.
And I gave her some, and I said, now, these are not for your grandchildren.
Yeah.
I said, it isn't just because of the cost.
Yeah.
I said, it's because they don't appreciate it. When a person guzzles down a $600 bottle of wine, they're not appreciating it. They've lost it. Mm-hmm. Or you take a really wonderful tea, and they drink it like Lipton's. So it's one of my professors used to say, if you can't tell the difference between an expensive bottle of wine and a bottle of vinegar, drink the vinegar.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot less expensive.
One of my dear friends is in Norway, and she had mentioned, this is several years ago, she had mentioned that she was going to give her family an American breakfast. I said, what are you having? She described this, that, and the other thing, and pancakes. And I said, and syrup. And she said, what? And maple syrup. They've never had maple syrup.
Right.
Oh, my God. So, of course, I rushed out to the store and got some maple syrup.
Sure.
And sent that on. And she said, well, she hadn't decided. She tasted it, and of course it was this wonderful experience. She hadn't decided she was actually going to confess to the family that she had this. Wasn't necessarily going to share it.
Well, I think that's part of what we're getting at when we're talking about spirituality. I think the same is true of poetry.
Yes. Yeah.
Where you read poetry to people that have no appreciation for the metaphors and the symbolism of poetry, and they're looking at it in a materialist sense. I always think of Stalking by a Wood on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost, where that line is, in miles to go before I sleep, in miles to go before I sleep.
Yeah.
And there are people who say the second line is the spiritual, and the first one is the literal. Mm-hmm. And a person who has no notion of that, and the older you get, the more the second line comes true. Mm-hmm. The first line is the literal one, has always been.
Because you haven't traveled the miles.
You haven't traveled. Right. You don't know what it's like.
Yeah.
There's a certain level of identification here in terms of experience. Now, it may be that some people had negative spiritual experiences within religion, either because of discipline, or just the experience was negative. The people around them that were teaching them this. Some mean nuns, as an example.
Or with rulers in hand.
Right. Yeah. You will enjoy this.
Yes. Floggings will continue until morale improves.
Yeah. Well, there's an example of people who heighten their spirituality through torture. Mm-hmm. If you take the Shias during their holy days, where they use the flogging, they have these whips, cat o' nine tails or whatever they call them,
yes.
And they just flog themselves to bleeding masses, and from this they gain this spiritual high, and they apparently it's quite ecstatic. I don't identify with that.
Spiritual high, or is it your body's kicking in some
endorphins?
chemicals? I think your endorphins are
really driving you crazy, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it's a type of...
I think you've been starting with the whip as a question of sanity at that point.
But it's an example of a definition of an extreme in terms of spirituality. Or there's another, I think there's another expression or comparison here. People who have made love or have had sex, right away we've made a distinction.
Right.
I can't imagine even the hardcore atheist saying that when they made love to their partner, that they describe it in chemical terms.
Right.
Or just purely physical terms.
Right.
That other dimension, which they find difficult to define or talk about, to me is the spiritual. As I understand it, in Eastern philosophy, they actually go that route, like the Kama Sutra, that there are practices that are supposed to heighten their ecstasy or their experience, and it has nothing to do. They see it as a spiritual adventure, essentially. They don't see this as in the United States, we would study the Kama Sutra, heighten our pleasure. They're not looking at it in that way.
Right.
I mean, that's a product of.
Right.
But as I understand, that's not the reason for doing it in the first place. And to me, there's another distinction that a hardcore atheist needs to see the difference.
Yeah.
And they perhaps have never put it in that context, thought about it in a spiritual context.
And it's there's a shying away from that word and that concept of, because there's a desire to distinguish from the supernatural.
Right.
And where you and I come from as spiritual atheists is we don't buy into that supernatural component to us. It is entirely a natural thing. It is mental, chemical, physical, and that doesn't in any way distract from the experience itself.
Right.
That's fine. We either need to attach a higher power meaning to it,
Right.
nor do we need to dissemble it down to its naturalistic parts. Though, yes, it may be, and from our point of view, a very naturalist could be dissembled, yes, but it's still a wonderful spiritual experience. It's still the great chocolate, or whatever it is. And where I think in reading last year in one of the Center for Inquiry magazines, I think it was Free Inquiry, Paul Kurtz had written a piece that was about how in the secular humanist realm that there was a need for some way of putting secular humanist views into practice. And I immediately, of course, as someone with a practice of how to put those kinds of views into, that seemed pretty straightforward. But I can see the resistance to a more atheist blend of secular Buddhists rejecting the idea of meditation, because it is associated with mysticism and the supernatural and the woo, which drives me back, because it's not what at least early Buddhism was. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this episode of The Secular Buddhist, but we will be coming back to speak more with Grant and finish out the interview in our next episode, so please stay tuned. That should be coming out this weekend. Thanks very much. See you soon. If you would like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com. Each episode has its own page with show notes, references, and links to source materials. You'll also find resources on Buddhism, critical thinking, secularism, and links to the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi. John Kaizen Neptune and Taihei Shakuhachi's websites are both linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment, every single moment, you have a choice. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.